ongoing or definitive. Examining the words until and cleansed in Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14. A linguistic and historical analysis of its prophetic time frame. What if a single verse could alter the destiny of a church? What if a Hebrew phrase could redefine an entire belief system? The interpretation of Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 remains a pivotal debate in prophetic theology, particularly regarding its temporal framework. Some scholars view the 2,300 evenings and mornings as marking a definitive prophetic endpoint, while others argue that the cleansing of the sanctuary initiates an ongoing process of restoration, also known as the investigative judgment. However, if the SDA interpretation of this passage is proven false, then the sanctuary investigative judgment must be either revised or abandoned entirely. One passage, two interpretations. A theological shift that shaped a movement. We aim to demonstrate that this study establishes a clear prophetic endpoint, shaping how we interpret biblical prophecy, historical fulfillment, and theological doctrines, rather than endorsing a prolonged purification process. Additionally, this study will examine whether Adventism's interpretation aligns with the Hebrew text, or if it was adapted to preserve a failed prophecy. Historical context from Miller to Adventism. William Miller initially interpreted Daniel 8 verse 14 as signaling Christ's second coming, believing the cleansing of the sanctuary marked the end of time, following the Great Disappointment of 1844. Seventh-day Adventists redefined the prophecy, interpreting the sanctuary's purification as the beginning of the investigative judgment, a continuous process lasting until Christ's final return. Unraveling one of the most debated prophecies in biblical theology. This study will examine the grammatical structure of Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14, the historical transition between Millerism and Adventism, the implications of these interpretations on Christian eschatology. The findings will critically evaluate whether Daniel 8 verse 14 signifies an exact moment of transformation or a continuous unfolding of judgment and restoration. Was it a climactic moment or the beginning of an extended judgment process? Does this prophecy mark a definitive end, or does it set in motion an unfolding divine review? Get ready. We're about to break this down linguistically, theologically, and historically like never before. Section 1. The vision and its theological significance. Context: the expansion of the little horn. Daniel sees a ram, Medo-Persia, and a goat, Greece, in battle. The goat's great horn, Alexander the Great, breaks, leading to 4 smaller horns, representing the division of his empire. From one of these, a little horn emerges, growing toward the south, east, and the beautiful land, Israel, Daniel 8 verse 9. This little horn magnifies itself, halts daily sacrifices, and tramples the sanctuary, Daniel 8 verses 11 to 12. Historically, scholars identify this figure as Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jewish temple in 167 BC, while others see it as a foreshadowing of a future eschatological ruler, possibly the Antichrist. Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14, literal translation. Verse 13, question: until when is the vision, the regular, sacrifice, the transgression that makes desolate, the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to trampling? Verse 14, answer: until evening morning 2300, then the sanctuary shall be made right. This translation preserves the Hebrew structure, particularly until and nidak shall be cleansed/vindicated, ensuring accuracy and meaning. The 2,300 evenings and mornings in Daniel 8 verse 14 refer to a period of desolation, during which the sanctuary was defiled and its proper services interrupted. This time frame is often interpreted as symbolic of a long duration of oppression, particularly under the rule of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jewish temple by halting sacrifices and introducing pagan worship. At the end of this period, the sanctuary was cleansed, meaning its rightful worship was restored. Historically, this aligns with the Maccabean revolt, which led to the purification and rededication of the temple in 165 BC, an event commemorated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is referenced in John 10 verse 22, where Jesus is said to have been in the temple during the Feast of Dedication. This suggests that Hanukkah was recognized and observed during his time. The holiday commemorates the rededication of the Second Temple in Jerusalem after its desecration by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The Maccabean revolt led to the purification of the temple, and according to tradition, a small amount of oil miraculously lasted 8 days, inspiring the lighting of the menorah. Contextual framework leading to verse 13. The little horn magnifies itself against God, disrupting worship. The daily sacrifice Hadamid is abolished, signaling a desecration of the sanctuary. God's sanctuary and his people are subjected to oppression under this rising power. Verse 13, the defining question. As Daniel observes this devastation, he hears two holy ones conversing. One asks, "Until when?" Directly referencing the daily sacrifice, transgression, and trampling of the sanctuary and host. This question anticipates a fixed time period, implying an endpoint to desecration rather than a prolonged restoration process. Verse 14. The answer. The response, until 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. The Hebrew term, until, establishes a defined timeframe, reinforcing a specific prophetic duration. The verb nidak shall be cleansed/vindicated suggests either restoration or judgment, depending on interpretation. Why this context matters. The saints expect a resolution, not a gradual purification process. The structured conversation supports a definite prophetic endpoint, rather than an extended sanctification phase. Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 is central to biblical prophecy, historical events, and theological doctrines, shaping eschatological understanding. Section 2. Theology and historical shift in Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 interpretation. What changed? This section examines whether Adventism's interpretation aligns with the Hebrew text, or if it was adapted to justify the Great Disappointment. The Great Disappointment and Doctrinal Shift. William Miller initially believed Daniel 8 verse 14 referred to Christ's second coming, predicting his return in 1844. When this failed, Adventists reinterpreted the prophecy rather than abandoning it, shaping it into the doctrine of investigative judgment. They taught that instead of returning to earth, Christ entered the most holy place in heaven, beginning a review of believers' cases, a doctrine central to Adventist theology today. From single event to ongoing judgment. Before 1844, the sanctuary's cleansing was seen as a decisive moment, possibly Christ's return. After 1844, the cleansing became a continuous process, the investigative judgment, lasting until Christ's second coming. Hiram Edson's October 23, 1844 vision led to this shift. Joseph Bates and Ellen G. White expanded the idea, teaching that salvation isn't finalized until this heavenly review concludes. Historical perspectives and theological debates. Early Christian views. Church Fathers, Hippolytus, Origen, Augustine, saw Daniel 8 verse 14 as Christ's redemptive work, not an investigative process. Clement of Rome, c. 95 AD. Let us look steadfastly to the blood of Christ and see how precious that blood is to God, which, having been shed for our salvation, has set the grace of repentance before the whole world. 1 Clement 7, Ignatius of Antioch, c. 110 AD. Let my spirit be counted as nothing for the sake of the cross, which is a stumbling block to those that do not believe, but to us salvation and life eternal. Letter to the Ephesians 18, Origen, c. 185 to 253 AD. Origen saw Christ's atonement as a ransom that liberated humanity from sin and death. He emphasized that Christ's sacrifice was not just a legal transaction, but a cosmic victory over evil. Augustine, c. 354 to 430 AD, Augustine taught that Christ's atonement was both substitutionary and transformative, stating that Christ, though guiltless, took upon himself the punishment of the guilty, that he might cancel the debt owed by sinners. These fathers generally saw Christ's work as completed and effective, rather than an ongoing investigative process. Martin Luther emphasized that Jesus' atonement was a complete and sufficient act of reconciliation between God and humanity. Methodists highlight Christ's victory over sin and death, viewing atonement as not just a legal transaction, but a restoration of humanity's relationship with God. Believing that Christ's finished work on the cross initiates a lifelong process of spiritual growth, Hebrews 9 verses 11 to 15 affirms Christ's atonement as complete, contrasting Adventism's ongoing judgment. Model: Adventist reinterpretation. William Miller, 1830s, 1844, saw Daniel 8 verse 14 as Christ's return based on biblical timelines. Post 1844 Adventist Writings, Edson, Bates, White, redefined the prophecy as a heavenly judgment phase. Ellen G. White stated, in 1844, Jesus entered the most holy place to begin the final atonement and cleanse the sanctuary. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, pages 162, 197, 198. Ellen G. White's interpretation of Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14. In 1844, Jesus entered the most holy place to begin the final atonement and cleanse the sanctuary, has significant theological implications for Christianity. Contrasts with traditional atonement views. While mainstream Christian theology holds that Christ's atonement was completed on the cross, Hebrews 9 verses 11 to 15, Adventism introduces a two-phase process, culminating in the investigative judgment. Sanctuary typology. White's statement builds on the Old Testament Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, interpreting Christ's movement into the most holy place as the fulfillment of a final cleansing before his second coming. Judgment and salvation. This doctrine asserts a pre-Advent judgment, where believers' lives are examined before Christ's return, a perspective differing from traditional Protestant views, which emphasize justification by faith without an ongoing investigative phase. Historical controversy. Many theologians argue that Daniel 8 verse 14 refers to the Maccabean restoration, not a heavenly event. Early church fathers affirmed that Christ's atonement was fully completed through his death and resurrection, rejecting a two-phase process. Even within Adventism, some SDA scholars hold differing views. Challenges to the investigative judgment doctrine. Many Adventist scholars and ministers have rejected or questioned investigative judgment, citing biblical, historical, and theological concerns. Albion Ballinger, 1905, challenged the doctrine, arguing Christ entered the most holy place at his ascension, not in 1844. Desmond Ford, 1980, publicly refuted investigative judgment, leading to his removal from SDA ministry. Walter Ray, Dale Ratzlaff, Raymond Cottrell criticized the doctrine's biblical foundation. Prophetic transition, Millerism versus Adventist theology. Miller's expectation. The 2,300 years ended in 1844, signaling Christ's return. The great disappointment. Christ doesn't return. Believers face crisis. Hiram Edson's vision. Christ enters the heavenly most holy place, not returning to earth. Adventist reinterpretation. Investigative judgment begins. Daniel 8 verse 14 now refer to an ongoing review process. Did Adventists adapt or preserve prophecy? Rather than admitting an interpretive failure, Adventists reshaped Daniel 8 verse 14 to fit the 1844 timeline, turning a climactic event into a gradual investigative phase. The development of the sanctuary doctrine within early Adventism was shaped by key figures like Hiram Edson, Crozier, and Ellen G. White. Hiram Edson's vision, 1844. After October 22, 1844, when Christ did not return as expected, Hiram Edson reportedly saw a vision of Christ entering the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, rather than returning to earth. This led to the belief that 1844 marked the beginning of Christ's final atonement work instead of his second coming. In 1846, Crozier expanded on Edson's vision in the Daystar, arguing that Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary was two-phased, with the second phase starting in 1844. This interpretation became central to SDA theology, forming the basis for the investigative judgment doctrine. Crozier's Sanctuary Doctrine, 1846. Building on Edson's vision, O.R.L. Crozier wrote an extensive study on the sanctuary, published in the Daystar in 1846. His article elaborated on the idea that Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary was two-phased, with the second phase beginning in 1844. This interpretation became foundational to Seventh-day Adventist theology, particularly the doctrine of the investigative judgment. Ellen G. White's endorsement. Ellen White later endorsed Crozier's sanctuary study, stating that God had given him insight into the truth. She affirmed that the sanctuary doctrine was divinely revealed, reinforcing its importance as a pillar of Adventist faith. White's visions further shaped the doctrine, emphasizing that Christ's work in the most holy place involved judgment and cleansing. Ellen G. White affirmed Crozier's sanctuary doctrine, stating that she had received a vision confirming its truth. In a letter dated April 21, 1847, she wrote, "The Lord showed me in vision more than 1 year ago that Brother Crozier had the true light on the cleansing of the sanctuary, etc., and that it was his will that Brother Crozier shall write out the view which he gave us in the Daystar Extra, February 7, 1846. I feel fully authorized by the Lord to recommend that extra to every saint." This endorsement played a significant role in shaping Adventist theology, particularly the doctrine of the investigative judgment. White's visions reinforced the belief that Christ's work in the heavenly sanctuary was ongoing, rather than completed at the cross. This doctrine remains central to Adventist eschatology, distinguishing it from other Christian interpretations of atonement and judgment. Key consequences. 1844 now marks the start of investigative judgment, not Christ's return. Adventism builds an entire theological system around an ongoing review process. If Daniel 8 verse 14 describes a completed event, investigative judgment lacks grammatical and contextual support. Section 3. Grammatical breakdown, technical analysis. To determine the prophetic nature of Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14, two key Hebrew terms define its meaning. First, ad until marks a fixed limit. Functions as a temporal boundary, indicating the prophecy ends at a specific point. Grammatically does not allow for a continuous event, reinforcing a definitive stopping point. Second, Nidak shall be cleansed/vindicated, a completed action. Nifl stem, passive, the sanctuary undergoes cleansing, rather than cleansing itself. Perfect tense denotes a completed action, ruling out an ongoing purification process. Question-answer structure, a fixed resolution. Daniel hears two holy ones conversing, which establishes the expectation of a definitive event. The saints ask, until when? Expecting a specific endpoint to desecration. The response is direct and numerical, until 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Another example of the word until appears in Daniel 12 verses 6 to 7, where it marks a fixed duration leading to a definitive event. Daniel 12 verses 6 to 7 uses the same until when phrase. Daniel 12 verse 6, question, until when shall be the end of these wonders? Daniel 12 verse 7, answer, it shall be for a time, times and half a time, then all these things shall be finished. Like Daniel 8 verse 14, this passage establishes a definitive time period concluding in a completed event. Evaluating the SDA interpretation. Ad plus nidac in perfect tense grammatically support a definite endpoint. Adventist theology alters the meaning, transforming a singular moment of cleansing into a prolonged investigative judgment. Key linguistic observations. Ignoring nidac's perfect tense allows theological reinterpretation. A strict grammar favors a completed event, not a progressive review. Millwright and evangelical perspectives align with prophecy's structure, while Adventism extends the meaning beyond the natural Hebrew construction. Final verdict: prophecy as a definite endpoint. Context and grammar point to a fixed limit. The structured conversation, numerical timeframe, and verb tense all support a climactic event. Adventist interpretation alters the text. While the investigative judgment preserved faith after 1844, it does not align with the direct grammatical meaning. The Hebrew text strongly supports a decisive event, contradicting the Adventist interpretation of a prolonged investigative phase. Understanding the 2,300 evenings and mornings in Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14. The 2,300 evenings and mornings in Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 represent a fixed prophetic timeframe during which the sanctuary undergoes defilement and is ultimately cleansed. This period marks a specific and definitive endpoint, beyond which no additional prophetic action occurs. Key aspects of the timeframe. Fixed duration. The prophecy explicitly states 2,300 evenings and mornings, interpreted as either literal days or symbolic years, depending on the exegetically approach. Sanctuary defilement. The passage describes a period of trampling and desecration, often linked to Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and the Maccabean Restoration, or, in Adventist theology, to 1844 and the investigative judgment. Cleansing at the end. The prophecy concludes with the sanctuary being cleansed, marking the end of the timeframe with no further prophetic event beyond this point. Important note: regardless of whether the 2,300 period is understood as ending in 1844, Adventist view, or in the Maccabean era, historical view, the prophecy itself does not extend beyond its fixed ending period. Any interpretation that suggests a continuation or additional events must contend with the explicit closure indicated in Daniel 8 verse 14. Section 4. The conversation in verse 13, unlocking the meaning of verse 14. How verse 13 shapes verse 14. The question-answer structure in Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 establishes a clear expectation of resolution, not a gradual purification process. The saints inquire until when, anticipating a fixed endpoint rather than an ongoing phase. The question of the saint in verse 13. Until when? Ad mate indicates an expectation of a definitive conclusion to the desecration. L with macron, to be trampled. The infinitive construct implies continuous oppression leading up to a final cleansing, reinforcing the need for resolution. The answer of the saint in verse 14. Until 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. The numerical limitation marks a fixed termination point, ruling out an ongoing purification process. The answer in verse 14 defines a parameter because it establishes a clear boundary, specifically, that the numerical limit signifies a definite endpoint, eliminating the possibility of an ongoing purification process. This interpretation reinforces the idea that once the designated period concludes, the event, such as the cleansing of the sanctuary, is completed rather than extended indefinitely. Why this conversation confirms a fixed endpoint. Verse 13 establishes the expectation of resolution. The saints aren't asking about an ongoing process. They seek an answer to when the desecration will end. Verse 14 provides a precise answer. The sanctuary is cleansed at the conclusion of the 2,300 evenings and mornings, signifying a definitive endpoint rather than an extended purification process. The 2,300 evenings and mornings set a fixed boundary, meaning that no further process or action extends beyond this timeframe. The sanctuary cleansing happens at the conclusion of this period, marking the end of desolation rather than an ongoing purification. This interpretation challenges theological views that suggest a prolonged investigative phase after 1844. In Daniel 8 verse 14, the answer of the saint, until functions as a stopping point, marking the end of a defined period. The cleansing of the sanctuary marks the completion of the prophecy, meaning that no additional events occur beyond the period of desecration. Together, the structured conversation, numerical timeframe, and grammatical construction confirm Daniel 8 verse 14 describe a singular climactic event, not an extended investigative process. The prophecy sets a fixed resolution, not a prolonged investigative judgment process. Section 5. Conclusion and final takeaways on Daniel 8. What does Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 actually say? At the heart of this debate lies a fundamental question. Does this prophecy describe a definite moment or an ongoing process? Theological debate. What does the text say? The word until is a fixed time marker, signaling a set duration with a definitive endpoint. The phrase shall be cleansed or vindicated appears in perfect tense, confirming a completed action, not an extended process. Verse 13's structured dialogue. The saints expect resolution, not gradual purification, reinforcing that Daniel 8 verse 14 describes a climactic event rather than an ongoing phase. These linguistic elements directly challenge the Adventist interpretation, which reframes Daniel 8 verse 14 as the beginning of investigative judgment, instead of recognizing it as a prophetic fulfillment concluding desecration. Context and grammar prove a definite endpoint. Verse 13 demands a precise resolution, rejecting an extended process. Verse 14 provides a structured response, defining a completed event, not ongoing purification. Until, plus nidak, cleansed, in perfect tense, is definitive grammatical proof that the prophecy concludes, finish, in a singular moment of vindication. Adventist theology alters the text's original meaning. To preserve Miller's timeline, Adventists expanded the meaning, shifting a moment of cleansing into an indefinite investigative judgment lasting until Christ's second coming. Investigative judgment is a theological development, not the direct grammatical meaning of Daniel 8 verse 14. Final verdict. Daniel 8 verses 13 to 14 presents a prophetic structure anticipating a climactic event, not an evolving investigative phase. The Hebrew text decisively favors an event-based fulfillment, contradicting the Adventist interpretation of an extended celestial review. The great disappointment led to a theological reinterpretation, but the original Hebrew framework supports a definitive moment of cleansing. Investigative judgment is an Adventist theological adaptation, not the direct meaning of Daniel 8 verse 14. Closing statement. 1. Prophecy. 2. Competing interpretations. A theological shift that reshaped an entire movement. Did Daniel 8 verse 14 marks a singular climactic event? Or did it set in motion an ongoing investigative process? Now, clear evidence stands before you. This moment calls for reflection. Truth is not merely a concept, it demands pursuit and engagement, not passive acceptance. The sanctuary doctrine, Daniel's prophecy, and the writings of the early church fathers all point to divine restoration in the Maccabean era. Or do you choose to ignore the grammatical analysis of verses 13 and 14, even after studying the usage of until and cleansed, reading the church fathers on Daniel 8, and examining Christ's completed atonement as described in Hebrews 9 verses 11 to 15?